Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are whispers that travel between the stars, not through vox channels or astropathic choirs, but through something far older and more primal. They are the stories told by soldiers who should have died but didn't, by guardsmen who watched their final barricade crumble and made peace with whatever gods they believed in, only to see something impossible step out of thin air and turn the tide of a battle that was already lost. These stories share common details, the kind of details that make inquisitors nervous and chaplains quiet. Black armor, bone-white markings, flames that flicker across ceramite plate without burning, without heat, without any source that a rational mind can explain. And eyes, if you can call them that, hollow and pale, are staring out from behind helms, decorated with skulls and symbols of death that seem less like decoration and more like prophecy. They never announce themselves. They never request orders. They never explain where they came from or why they chose this moment, this battlefield, this desperate last stand to make their presence known. They simply appear, like a memory you forgot you had, like a prayer you didn't realize you were speaking aloud. And when the killing is done, when the enemy lies broken and the survivors are still trying to understand what just happened, they vanish. No tracks, no heat signatures, no residue on the Auspex scanners, nothing but the dead they left behind and the impossible fact that you are still alive to talk about it. They are called the Legion of the Damned, and in all the vast, sprawling, blood-soaked history of the Imperium of man, there may be no greater mystery than who they really are. They have been documented, appearing across the breadth of the Imperium, from the Segmentum Solar to the Eastern Fringe, from the frozen wastes of ice worlds to the blistering surfaces of death worlds, where even the atmosphere is lethal. No environment deters them. No hazard affects them. Witness accounts describe them crossing rivers of molten lava without apparent concern, advancing through chemical weapons that would dissolve standard power armor, and operating in hard vacuum with no visible life support systems. They are, by every conventional metric, impossible, and yet the bodies of their enemies, very real and very dead, testify to their undeniable presence. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are going to lose ourselves in one of the most fascinating, haunting, and genuinely unsettling corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Legion of the Damned sits at the intersection of ghost story, military legend, theological nightmare, and one of the most tragic chapter histories ever committed to the archives of the Adeptus Astartes. They are warriors who exist between life and death, between the material universe and the screaming madness of the warp. And depending on who you ask, they are either the cursed remnants of a chapter that lost everything, the literal demons of the Emperor himself, psychic echoes of 10,000 years of war, or something else entirely that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. What I want to do tonight is take you through every layer of this mystery. Well, we're going to start at the very beginning, with a founding that earned its name through suffering and mutation and broken promises. We're going to follow the Firehawks, a chapter whose history reads like a tragedy written by someone who hated happy endings, through wars and betrayals and catastrophes that would have broken lesser warriors. We're going to watch them disappear into the warp and emerge as something that shouldn't exist. And then we're going to examine every theory, every sighting, every piece of evidence that might help us understand what the Legion of the Damned truly is. So settle in, get comfortable, let the ambient sounds wash over you, and let me tell you a story about warriors who refused to stop fighting, even after they should have been dead. The galaxy of the 41st Millennium is not a kind place. You know this if you've spent any time at all exploring the lore of Warhammer 40,000. It is a galaxy where the light of reason has been replaced by the flickering candle of superstition, where humanity's greatest empire stretches across 1,000,000 worlds, but cannot protect most of them from the horrors that press in from every direction. Orcs rampage across entire sectors with gleeful, savage abandon. Tyrannid hive fleets devour world after world with the cold efficiency of a biological machine. the forces of chaos whisper from the warp, offering power and damnation in equal measure. And at the center of it all sits the Emperor of mankind on his golden throne, a being of unimaginable psychic power who has not spoken a word in 10,000 years, sustaining the astronomicon that guides humanity's ships through the warp, while his body slowly decays around him. In this galaxy, miracles are suspect. Divine intervention is a concept that the Imperium simultaneously depends upon and refuses to examine too closely, because the questions it raises are the kind that get entire worlds purged by the Inquisition. And yet, again and again across the millennia, forces of the Imperium on the brink of annihilation have reported the same phenomenon. Spectral warriors in black armor, wreathed in fire that doesn't burn, fighting with weapons that glow with an inner light. They appear without warning. They fight with devastating precision and power, and they disappear when the battle is won, leaving nothing behind but questions and the lingering smell of ozone and something else. It's something that the survivors can never quite identify, but that stays with them for the rest of their lives. The Imperium has files on these appearances. The Inquisition has dedicated entire cadres of investigators to tracking them. Space Marine chapters whisper about them in the quiet moments between campaigns, trading stories the way soldiers have always traded stories about things they've seen that they can't explain. And every investigation, every inquiry, every attempt to capture, contain, or even definitively identify these spectral warriors has ended in frustration. The Legion of the Damned does not want to be understood, or perhaps more accurately, whatever force guides them does not wish their nature to be revealed. But we are going to try anyway, because that's what we do here. We dig into the lore, we examine the evidence, and we try to make sense of a universe that was designed from the ground up to resist easy answers. So let us begin where all tragedies begin, with hope. Specifically, with the hope of the Adeptus Mechanicus that they could improve upon the work of the Emperor himself, and the catastrophic consequences of that hubris. To understand the Legion of the Damned, we first need to understand where they came from, and to do that, we need to go back to one of the most ambitious and most disastrous projects in Imperial history. The 21st founding of the Space Marines, known to history as the Cursed Founding, took place in 991 of the 35th millennium, right on the cusp of the 36th millennium, shortly before the nightmare period known as the Age of Apostasy. This was the largest creation of new Space Marine chapters since the legendary Second Founding that followed the Horus Heresy, and it was driven by an ambition that bordered on arrogance. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those robed priests of the machine god who maintain the Imperium's technology, had decided that the time had come to perfect the gene seed of the Space Marines. Now, to understand why this was such a dangerous idea, you need to appreciate what gene seed actually is. It is the biological template from which Space Marines are made, a collection of specialized organs derived from the genetic material of the Primarchs themselves, those 20 demigod-like beings created by the Emperor to lead his great crusade across the galaxy. Over the 10,000 years since the heresy, many of these gene seed lines had developed flaws and mutations. The Blood Angels suffered from the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, a genetic madness that caused them to relive the final moments of their Primarch Sanguinius. The Space Wolves struggled with the curse of the Wolfen, a bestial transformation that could claim even the most disciplined warrior. Other chapters had developed subtler defects, degradation of specific implant organs, unexplained mutations, or simply a slow decline in the viability of their gene seed over successive generations. The Adeptus Mechanicus believed they could fix all of this. Their goal was nothing less than the creation of a new breed of Space Marine, one that was free of the accumulated genetic damage of 10 millennia, and that could potentially match the capabilities of the Primarchs themselves. As they called this project Homo sapiens novus, the new human, and it was pursued with the kind of zealous enthusiasm that the Mechanicus brings to all its endeavors, which is to say, with very little wisdom and even less humility. There are whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that the entire project was compromised from the start. Some sources suggest that the data informing the 21st Founding's genetic modifications was traced back to the warp itself, possibly originating from none other than Fabius Bile, the renegade emperor's children apothecary known as the Clone Lord, whose centuries-long obsession with genetic perfection had led him down paths that would make most tech priests recoil in horror. But whether Bile actively sabotaged the project, or whether the Mechanicus simply stumbled upon his corrupted research and failed to recognize the taint is unclear, but the implication is chilling. The largest space marine founding since the second founding may have been built on a foundation poisoned by chaos from the very beginning. The project was stopped when someone within the Adeptus Terra discovered that data feeding into the founding plan was originating from the warp and traced it back to its source. By then, the damage was done. The results were catastrophic. The genitors of the Adeptus Mechanicus proved far less skilled in the art of genetic manipulation than the Emperor and his original researchers had been. Their modifications introduced new flaws even as they attempted to correct old ones, sometimes creating problems worse than the ones they were trying to solve. The chapters born from this founding were plagued by mutation, madness, and misfortune on a scale that defied coincidence and suggested something deeply, fundamentally wrong with the entire endeavor. The Flame Falcons, for instance, were declared traitors by the Inquisition and nearly wiped out by the Grey Knights after their bodies spontaneously burst into flames during battle, flames that did not burn their own flesh, but terrified everyone around them. The Lamenters, derived from Blood Angel's gene seed, seemed to have been freed from the Black Rage only to be cursed with the worst luck of any chapter in Imperial history, suffering disaster after disaster until their name became synonymous with noble suffering. While the Black Dragons developed bony growths that protruded from their forearms and skulls, mutations that made them fearsome in close combat but earned them the suspicion of the Inquisition, which watched them constantly for signs of chaos taint. Many of the chapters created during the 21st Founding eventually fell to chaos, went renegade, or simply ceased to exist, consumed by their own genetic instability or destroyed by an Imperium that could not tolerate their defects. The entire founding became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the works of the Emperor were not to be tampered with by lesser minds. And among all the cursed chapters born from this ill-fated endeavor, perhaps none had a more dramatic or more mysterious fate than the Firehawks. But there is a dark irony in the fact that a chapter born under such a shadow of genetic uncertainty would go on to serve the Imperium with such ferocious loyalty. But that is exactly what the Firehawks did, at least for a time. Their story is one of unrelenting service, repeated catastrophe, and an eventual transformation that took them beyond the boundaries of what anyone thought possible for a Space Marine chapter. Whether that transformation was a curse, a blessing, or something else entirely depends on which theory you subscribe to. But before we get to the theories, we need to follow the Firehawks through the long and bloody road that led them to their fate. The Firehawks were created during the cursed 21st Founding, emerging into a galaxy that was about to tear itself apart. The chapter always claimed descent from the Ultramarines, asserting that their gene seed was drawn from the proud lineage of Reboot Guilliman himself. But the records held in the archives of the Adeptus Terra told a different story. The genetic samples preserved from the Firehawks showed defects and variations that didn't match known ultramarine patterns, and the Lords of Macragge never publicly acknowledged any kinship with the chapter. This discrepancy was never resolved, and it added another layer of uncertainty to a chapter that was already burdened with the stigma of the cursed founding. Whatever their true genetic heritage, the Firehawks proved themselves to be warriors of exceptional skill and ferocity from the very beginning. They were also notable for something unusual among Space Marine chapters. They were devout adherents of the Imperial cult, in believing in the emperor's divinity with a fervor that set them apart from most Astartes, who tend to revere the emperor as the greatest of men rather than as a literal god. While the Codex Astartes and the broader traditions of the Adeptus Astartes generally avoid the question of the emperor's divinity, preferring to honor him as a supreme commander and genetic patriarch rather than as a deity, the Firehawks embraced the full theology of the ecclesiarchy. They prayed to the emperor as a god, they treated their battles as holy crusades, and they viewed their service not as military duty, but as sacred obligation. This devotion would prove profoundly significant later, when theories about the Legion of the Damned began to take shape. But at the time, it was simply one more characteristic that made the Firehawks distinct among their brother chapters. It also created certain tensions with more orthodox chapters, who viewed such overt religiosity as a deviation from the secular traditions established by the Primarchs. But the Firehawks were not the kind of chapter that worried about what other chapters thought of them. They knew who they served, they knew why they fought, and they carried that certainty like a shield against every hardship the galaxy threw at them. Their first major engagement came during the Age of Apostasy, one of the darkest periods in Imperial history. This was the era when the Mad High Lord, Goj Vandir, seized control of both the secular and religious arms of the Imperium, plunging the entire civilization into civil war. As the Firehawks fought alongside the Black Templars, the Imperial Fists, the Soul Drinkers, and the Martian Scutari against Vandir's forces, distinguishing themselves through their courage and their willingness to sacrifice everything for the Emperor's cause. But this service came at a terrible cost. During the fighting, the Firehawks' homeworld of Joros was destroyed by thermal bombs, reducing an entire planet to an irradiated wasteland. For a Space Marine chapter, the loss of a homeworld is one of the most devastating blows imaginable. It means the loss of recruiting grounds, of sacred sites, of the cultural traditions that give a chapter its identity. Many chapters have been broken by such losses. The Firehawks survived, but the experience marked them deeply, as instilling a fierce determination that sometimes crossed the line into recklessness. When the Age of Apostasy finally ended, and the reformer Sebastian Thor restored order to the Imperium, the Firehawks were rewarded for their loyalty and sacrifice. Thor himself granted them the right to use the Rapturus Rex as their new fortress monastery. The Rapturus Rex was an ancient mobile star fortress, a vast vessel believed to be pre-imperial in origin, possibly dating back to the age of technology. It was a ship of almost unimaginable power, capable of scouring the surface of a world within minutes of its arrival in orbit, and it carried enough firepower to challenge an entire squadron of Imperial cruisers on its own. With the Rapturus Rex as their new home, the Firehawks became a fleet-based chapter, roaming the galaxy in search of the Emperor's enemies. The Rapturus Rex itself deserves special mention because it would play a crucial role in the Legion of the Damned mystery later on. This was no ordinary warship. It was a relic of an age that predated the Imperium itself, possibly dating back to the era when humanity first reached for the stars, before the Age of Strife plunged civilization into 10,000 years of chaos and isolation. Its construction methods were beyond the understanding of the Adeptus Mechanicus, its systems incorporating technologies that the tech priests could maintain but never fully comprehend, let alone replicate. In terms of raw firepower, it outclassed anything short of a dedicated Imperial Navy battle group, and its void shields and armor made it virtually impervious to conventional weapons. The Firehawks did not simply inherit a ship when they received the Rapturus Rex. They inherited a legend. From this formidable base, the Firehawks conducted a series of campaigns known as the Castigations of Golgotha, 13 separate crusades through the war-torn Golgotha Wastes region of space that spanned from the 40th millennium all the way to the early 41st millennium. These campaigns earned them a reputation for devastating effectiveness and an equally formidable reputation for collateral damage. The Firehawks did not fight with surgical precision. They fought with overwhelming force, burning everything in their path and trusting that the emperor would sort the righteous from the damned. This reputation made them both respected and feared within the Imperium, and it set the stage for their involvement in one of the most politically complex conflicts in recent Space Marine history, the Badab War. The Badab War began in 901 of the 41st Millennium and lasted for 7 years, pitting loyalist Space Marine chapters against the secessionist forces of the Astral Claws chapter and their allies. It was a conflict born of corruption, ambition, and the kind of political maneuvering that Space Marines are supposed to be above, but never truly are. Luft Huron, the chapter master of the Astral Claws, had gradually expanded his power in the Maelstrom Zone, an area of space plagued by warp storms and Xenos incursions, until he was effectively ruling an independent empire. He withheld tithes from the Imperium, claiming the resources were needed for local defense, and built his forces well beyond the limits prescribed by the Codex Astartes. He attracted other chapters to his cause, forming a loose coalition of secessionists that included the Mantis Warriors, the Lamenters, and the Executioners. It was exactly the kind of slow-building crisis that the Imperium's cumbersome bureaucracy is worst at handling. By the time the High Lords of Terra recognized the scope of the problem and authorized a military response, Huron had dug in deeply, fortifying his holdings and preparing for the war he knew was coming. The result was one of the most politically divisive conflicts in the history of the Adeptus Astartes, a war that pitted Space Marine against Space Marine and raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of chapter autonomy and the consequences of Imperial neglect. But the Firehawks were among the first loyalist chapters to become involved in the conflict, after one of their vessels, the Red Harbinger, was attacked and captured by the Mantis Warriors, one of the secessionist chapters. Their chapter master, Stibor Lazarek, was a veteran of more than 6 centuries of warfare, a proud and bitter man who bore grudges with the same intensity that he bore his weapons. He had already nursed a personal grudge against Luftgott Huron after being passed over for command during the earlier Lycanthos Drift campaign, and the capture of his vessel gave him all the justification he needed to throw the full weight of his chapter into the war. The Firehawks committed nearly their entire strength to the Badab War, including the mighty Raptorus Rex, which served as the most powerful warship in the entire conflict zone. Despite this overwhelming firepower, the chapter suffered horrific losses. By the 3rd year of the war, the Firehawks had been reduced to just 22% of their fighting strength, a level of attrition that threatened the chapter with extinction. They were forced to the sidelines, a humiliation that Lazarek bore with poorly concealed fury. But the old chapter master was not finished. He successfully petitioned for his chapter's return to active combat in the final years of the war, and the Raptorus Rex proved instrumental in the Angstrom blockade that helped bring the conflict to its conclusion. But not before Lazarek authorized one final act of vengeance that would cement the Firehawks' reputation for devastating force. In what became known as the firebombing of Sacristan, the Firehawks systematically destroyed the cities of a frontier world on the edge of the Endymion cluster, killing more than 90% of its population in a campaign of orbital bombardment that many considered strategically wasteful and morally indefensible. The Badab War ended with the defeat of the secessionists, but the Firehawks emerged from it battered, diminished, and carrying the weight of their actions at Sacristan. They had lost hundreds of battle brothers, countless support personnel, and much of the fleet that had made them such a formidable force. They needed time to rebuild, to recruit new Marines, to restore their strength to something approaching full capability. They would never get that time. In the year 963 of the 41st Millennium, the Firehawks received orders to deploy to the Crow's World subsector to deal with a flotilla of Dark Eldar raiders that had been terrorizing Imperial shipping lanes. The scale of the threat was significant enough that the entire chapter fleet was committed to the operation. The Raptorus Rex, 5 other warships, more than 800 battle brothers, the greatest strength the chapter had achieved since the end of the Badab War, and approximately 2,000 additional personnel made a successful warp jump from the Piraeus system, 120 light-years from their target coordinates. The journey should have taken no more than 12 hours. They never arrived. The ships, the fortress, the marines, the crew, over 2,800 souls in total, simply vanished. There was no distress signal, no debris field, no astropathic message, nothing. At one moment they were translating into the warp, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the Imperium as completely as if they had never existed at all. 20 years passed. 20 years of silence, of waiting, of hoping against hope that some fragment of the chapter might have survived. 20 years during which the Imperium conducted search after futile search, sending patrol vessels and astropathic probes into the region where the Firehawks had last been detected. Nothing was found. Not a single piece of wreckage, not a single body, not a single answer. In 983 of the 41st Millennium, the Firehawks were officially declared lost in the warp and presumed destroyed. The Great Bell of Lost Souls, that ancient instrument that tolls for every lost chapter, rang 1,000 times in their honor, and it is said, in the hushed archives where such things are recorded, that the Emperor himself ordered a black candle to be lit for them in the Adeptus Chapel of Fallen Heroes. The Firehawks, a chapter that had survived the destruction of 2 homeworlds, that had endured the slaughter of the Badab War, that had fought with uncompromising loyalty for centuries, were gone. But the story does not end there. It never does. Not in the 41st Millennium, where death is not always permanent, and the warp has a way of returning things that should stay lost. From the data that would eventually be recovered, the Imperium was able to piece together something of what had happened to the Firehawks during those lost years. Their fleet had been caught in a warp storm of terrific intensity, far beyond anything their navigators had predicted or their Geller fields could withstand. Ship after ship was destroyed as the tempest tore through their formation, consumed by warp entities or simply ripped apart by the impossible physics of the Imperium. The Rapturus Rex, ancient and powerful as it was, survived the initial onslaught, but even that mighty vessel could not escape the storm unscathed. The surviving Marines, those who had been aboard the Rapturus Rex when the other ships were lost, found themselves trapped in the warp, unable to navigate their way back to real space. The Geller field held, barely, but something was getting through. Not demons, not the screaming entities that usually assaulted ships caught in the Imperium, but something subtler and in many ways more terrible, a contagion, and a warp-borne disease that attacked the Marines at the cellular level, eating away at their enhanced physiology with a persistence that defied the efforts of the chapter's apothecaries. Imagine what that must have been like. You are a space marine, a warrior engineered to be the pinnacle of human biological achievement. Your body contains 19 additional organs that make you faster, stronger, and more resilient than any unaugmented human could ever hope to be. You can spit acid, survive in vacuum, enter a state of suspended animation, filter any poison from your blood. You are, by any reasonable definition, superhuman. And now something is inside you, something that your Laraman's organ cannot clot, that your ulitic kidney cannot filter, that your preomnor cannot neutralize. Something that is slowly, methodically, dismantling everything that makes you what you are. The disease was unlike anything in the Imperium's medical records. It attacked the very organs that made a space marine superhuman: the secondary heart, the multi-lung, the Betcher's gland. All of them began to fail or mutate in ways that the apothecaries could not predict or prevent. The catalepsian node, which allowed Marines to stay awake for days by putting half their brain to sleep at a time, began to malfunction, trapping some Marines in waking nightmares where they could not tell whether they were asleep or conscious. The mucranoid, which normally secreted a waxy substance that protected against vacuum and extreme temperatures, started producing a thick, dark residue that covered their skin in patches, making them look even more cadaverous than the disease was already making them. And the Marines began to die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, one by one, their enhanced bodies fighting the disease with every resource available to them and losing ground inch by inch. The pain was constant, the deterioration visible to the naked eye. Warriors who had been the pinnacle of human biological engineering watched as their own flesh betrayed them, wasting away until they were pale, gaunt shadows of the demigods they had once been. But the disease did not simply destroy. Even as it consumed their bodies, it changed them in ways that defied explanation. Their psychic awareness increased dramatically, far beyond what even the most gifted librarian could achieve naturally. They began to perceive things that should have been invisible to mortal senses, currents of warp energy, the flickering presence of entities in the Imperium, and something else, something that felt like a vast and distant will, a guiding intelligence that seemed to be aware of their suffering and their loyalty. And they grew stronger, not in the way that a healthy body grows strong through training and nourishment, but in a way that seemed to draw power from the very warp energy that was killing them. As their physical forms deteriorated, their combat capabilities actually increased, as if the disease was burning away everything that was unnecessary and leaving behind only the essence of the warrior. The Marines knew they were dying. Every one of them knew it, with the certainty that comes from watching your brothers waste away around you, from feeling the disease eating through your own tissues day by day. There was no cure, no treatment. There's no hope of recovery. The apothecaries confirmed what the Marines already knew in their hearts. The contagion was terminal, and every one of them was already dead. They just hadn't stopped moving yet. This was the moment that defined them. This was the crucible that transformed the Firehawks from a dying chapter into something that would haunt the battlefields of the Imperium for millennia to come. In any other situation, the realization that an entire chapter was dying might have led to despair, to surrender, to the kind of spiritual collapse that turns loyal servants of the Emperor into raving madmen, or worse, into willing servants of the dark gods who had caused their suffering. The warp was right there, all around them, pressing against the Geller field, whispering promises of relief and power and the cessation of pain. It would have been so easy to listen, so easy to let the corruption in and trade their loyalty for a few more years of existence, even if that existence was something monstrous. But the Firehawks had always been different from other chapters. They were believers, true believers, in the divinity of the Emperor and the sacred duty of Space Marines to defend humanity regardless of the personal cost. Their faith had sustained them through the destruction of 2 homeworlds, through the slaughter of the Badab War, through centuries of warfare that would have broken any ordinary soldiers 1,000 times over. And now, facing the certainty of their own extinction, that faith burned brighter than ever. They chose to die fighting. The decision was made collectively, without debate or dissent, because there was nothing to debate. They were Space Marines. They were the Emperor's weapons. And a weapon does not rust quietly in a corner when there are still enemies to destroy. A weapon is used until it breaks, and then its pieces are gathered and honored for the service they gave. The remaining warriors stripped their armor of all chapter insignia. The symbols of the Firehawks, the red phoenix rising from flames that had been their badge of identity for centuries, were removed. In their place, each Marine painted his armor black, the color of mourning, the color of endings, and decorated it with whatever emblems of death he chose. Most settled on a common theme: skulls, bones, and flames. The imagery of mortality, rendered in stark white against midnight black. They looked like what they were, the walking dead, in warriors who had already accepted their fate and were simply waiting for the universe to catch up. All ranks and companies were abolished. The chapter's hierarchy had already been devastated by the losses suffered in the warp storm, with most of their officers dead.
Now, I have to be honest with you, out of all the mysteries in the 40K universe, the Legion of the Damned is the one that genuinely unsettles me. And I mean that as the highest compliment. There's something about warriors who exist in that space between salvation and damnation, between the Emperor's light and the warp's darkness, that just hits different. Personally, I lean toward the Firehawks theory, the idea that their suffering in the warp transformed them into something holy, something willing to endure eternal torment just to protect their brothers one last time. That's the kind of tragedy that makes this setting so compelling to me, but honestly, part of me hopes we never get a definitive answer. Some mysteries are better left in the shadows. But yeah, let's continue the video.
The survivors were too few to maintain a functional command structure, and besides, rank seemed meaningless when everyone shared the same destination. All brothers were to be equal before death, leveled in station by the certainty of their collective assured extinction. They adopted a new name, one that reflected their transformed nature. They would be the Legion of the Damned, not damned in the chaos sense, not corrupted or fallen, but damned in the older, sadder meaning of the word, condemned, fated, sentenced to a death that was certain but whose timing remained unknown. They were the walking dead, and they knew it, and they wore that knowledge like armor more impenetrable than any ceramite plate. And then they went to war, using the Emperor's tarot, that mystical divination tool supposedly bound within the psychic will of the Emperor himself. The Legion determined where they were most needed. The warp contagion that was killing them had heightened their psychic awareness to such a degree that the tarot became almost supernaturally accurate in their hands, guiding them to battles where the Imperium's forces were on the verge of annihilation, to moments of desperate need where their intervention could mean the difference between survival and extinction for entire worlds. The first confirmed sighting came in 986 of the 41st Millennium, or when a routine Imperial patrol passed through the greenskin-held system of Jakortal. The squadron discovered scenes of unexpected devastation among the alien-held territories, evidence of a battle that the Imperium's forces could not have fought because there were no Imperial forces in the system. Someone, or something, had attacked the greenskins with devastating force and then vanished without a trace. 2 years later, in 987, a naval patrol vessel in the Maran subsector had a near collision with an unidentified ship. When the crew scanned the area after the close call, they discovered 2 standard space coffins with serial numbers matching equipment registered to the Firehawks chapter. The bodies inside could not be identified. Their flesh had decayed beyond recognition in ways that suggested exposure to warp energies. Then, in 988, an Imperial research station came under attack from a greenskin raiding party. The situation was desperate, the garrison outnumbered and outgunned, their ammunition running low and their defensive positions crumbling. Then, without warning, mysterious figures in black power armor appeared from nowhere. They fought with terrifying efficiency for approximately 30 minutes, leaving several hundred alien corpses in their wake, and then vanished as suddenly as they had arrived. They left behind a single item, the chapter banner of the Firehawks, gnarled and worn, bearing a new inscription in High Gothic, the words, "In dedicato imperatum ultra articulo mortis," for the Emperor beyond the point of death. Those words became the motto of the Legion of the Damned, and they tell you everything you need to know about the spirit that drives these warriors. Beyond the point of death, past the threshold where mortal service ends and something else begins. The Firehawks had died in the warp. What came back was something different, something that served the Emperor not out of duty or obligation, but out of a faith so absolute that even death could not extinguish it. There is one additional detail from the early sightings that adds another layer of strangeness to the Legion's story. In 806 of the 41st Millennium, more than a century before the Firehawks' disappearance, the frigate Solemnis was reportedly spewed from the Hadex anomaly in the Jericho Reach. The vessel had been part of the Firehawks' fleet, and it appeared approximately 150 years before the warp jump that supposedly destroyed the chapter. And the ship remained on location only long enough to transmit a single warning, a message about contagion, before disappearing back into the Reach. Then in 817 of the 41st Millennium, the Solemnis reappeared 3 times in as many weeks, each time engaging the enemies of the Imperium before vanishing again. The implications of these sightings are staggering. The warp does not obey the normal laws of time. A vessel lost in the immaterium might emerge centuries before it entered, or millennia after, or at multiple points simultaneously. The Solemnis appearances suggest that the Firehawks warp disaster did not occur at a single point in time, but rather scattered the chapter across temporal as well as spatial dimensions. The Legion of the Damned may not simply operate from a fixed base in the warp. They may exist in a state where past, present, and future have lost their meaning, appearing wherever and whenever the Emperor's tarot directs them, unconstrained by the linear progression of time that governs the rest of the universe. To witness the arrival of the Legion of the Damned is to witness something that does not belong in the material universe. Countless survivors have attempted to describe the experience, and their accounts, while varying in specific details, share a remarkable consistency in their core elements. What they describe is not simply the appearance of reinforcements on a battlefield. It is something closer to a religious experience, or a nightmare, or both at the same time. It always begins the same way. The situation is desperate. The defenders are outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of options. The enemy is closing in, and everyone knows it. Whereas the officers are calculating how many minutes they have left, and the soldiers are making their peace with whatever they believe in. This is the critical element, the point of absolute desperation, the moment when hope dies, and all that remains is the determination to sell your life as expensively as possible. And then the air changes. Survivors describe it differently. Some say the temperature drops, a sudden chill that has nothing to do with the ambient climate. Others report a change in the quality of the light, as if the world has shifted slightly on its axis, and the illumination is coming from a source that wasn't there a moment ago. Still others describe a sound, not the sound of dropships or teleportation beams, but something subtler, a low hum that seems to come from everywhere at once, as like the universe itself is vibrating at a frequency that human ears were never meant to detect. Then they appear. They do not drop from the sky. They do not teleport in with the characteristic flash of energy displacement. They simply manifest. One moment, the space is empty. The next, there are warriors standing there, as if they had always been present, and you had simply failed to notice them until now. They are tall, taller than standard space marines, or perhaps they only seem taller because of the way the light bends around them. Their armor is midnight black, so dark that it seems to absorb the illumination around it, and it is covered in markings that glow with an inner fire. Skulls, bones, flames, the symbols of death rendered in lines of pale fire that flicker and pulse as if the armor itself is alive. Their faces, us when visible, are deeply wrong. Those Marines who fight without helmets display features that are gaunt and pale, their skin stretched taut over bones that seem too sharp, their eyes sunken and hollow, but burning with an inner light that has nothing to do with the reflected illumination of the battlefield. They look like corpses that have decided, through sheer force of will, to continue functioning. They look like the dead wearing the skins of the living. Their weapons glow. This is one of the most consistent details in survivor accounts. The bolters carried by the legionnaires emit shells that burn with a spectral fire, rounds that seem to carry more destructive force than any standard bolt round should be capable of producing. But their power fists crackle with energies that are distinctly not the standard disruption fields used by Imperial technology. Everything about them is slightly wrong, slightly off, as if they exist in a frequency that is adjacent to reality, but not quite part of it. They do not speak. In the vast majority of recorded appearances, the legionnaires fight in total silence. No battle cries, no coordinated calls, no vox chatter. They communicate, if they communicate at all, through means that are invisible to outside observers. They advance with a terrible, implacable purpose, their movements synchronized in a way that suggests a shared consciousness or a guiding intelligence that exceeds anything achieved by standard Space Marine tactical doctrine. And they are devastatingly effective. The enemies of the Imperium, or whether they are greenskins or Chaos Marines or Tyranid bioforms or any other threat, die in enormous numbers when the Legion appears. Their weapons seem to bypass armor that should be proof against standard bolter fire. Their power fists crush targets that should be too well protected to be destroyed by such means. They advance through enemy fire that should be tearing them apart. And while hits occasionally find their mark, the damage seems temporary. Wounds close. Shattered armor reforms. Legionnaires who fall rise again, their spectral forms knitting back together as if the concept of permanent injury does not apply to them. The entire engagement rarely lasts more than an hour. When the enemy is broken, when the threat has been neutralized, the Legionnaires do not celebrate or take stock of their victory. That they do not tend to the wounded or speak with the survivors. They simply fade. The process is the reverse of their appearance, a gradual dimming, as if the connection that bound them to the material universe is weakening, and they are being drawn back to wherever they came from. Within minutes of the battle's end, they are gone, leaving behind nothing but the dead, the confused, and a mystery that has never been solved. Inquisitors who have attempted to capture or intercept the Legion of the Damned have universally failed. Events conspire against them with a consistency that suggests more than coincidence. Equipment malfunctions at critical moments. Communications are disrupted. Transport ships experience navigational errors that carry them to the wrong coordinates. It is as if reality itself bends around the Legion, protecting them from investigation, shielding them from any force that might seek to understand or control them. Whatever the Legion of the Damned is, it does not wish to be studied, and the universe appears to agree. Of all the recorded appearances of the Legion of the Damned, perhaps none is more thoroughly documented or more dramatic than their intervention on the cemetery world of Certus Minor in 996 of the 41st Millennium. This event forms the narrative core of the novel Legion of the Damned by Rob Sanders, and it provides the most detailed account we have of how the Legion operates and the devastating impact of their arrival on a battlefield that was already soaked in blood. Certus Minor was a quiet world, as worlds go in the Imperium. It was classified as an ecclesiastical cemetery world, met its surface covered with vast necropolises and memorial complexes dedicated to the honored imperial dead. It was a place of reverence and remembrance, a world where the living came to mourn the fallen, and the fallen rested in the carefully maintained silence of eternity. It was not a world that anyone expected to become a war zone. But the galaxy of the 41st Millennium does not care about expectations. The threat came in the form of the Holocaust Blood Crusade, a massive cornate warband following the trajectory of a blood-red comet across the galaxy, leaving a trail of devastation and death in its wake. These were followers of Khorne, the blood god, the most violent and straightforward of the chaos gods, a deity who cares nothing for subtlety or strategy and demands only that blood be spilled and skulls be taken. The Holocaust was led by chaos champions of terrifying power, warriors who had given themselves entirely to the blood god's service and received in return a strength and ferocity that could overwhelm even the most disciplined imperial defenders. The Excoriators, a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, dispatched their 5th company to defend Certus Minor. The Excoriators are a chapter known for their stoic determination and their willingness to endure punishment that would break other Marines, a spiritual inheritance from their parent chapter's legendary defense of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra. But the 5th company was already at reduced strength, having suffered losses in previous engagements, and the force they brought to Certus Minor was far too small to face the full might of the Holocaust. The company was led by a captain known as the Scourge, a warrior carrying the burden of a perceived failure, a lost chapter banner that weighed on him with the gravity of a personal dishonor. He was a brutal fighter, an embodiment of the Excoriator's creed of attrition warfare, and he refused to simply abandon an imperial world to the forces of chaos without a fight. He organized the defense of the capital necropolis of Obsequa City, marshalling every available resource, and prepared for a battle that he knew, in his heart, he could not win. The Holocaust came with overwhelming force, wave after wave of blood-maddened warriors and demons pouring into the streets of a city built to honor the dead. The World Eaters, those former sons of Angron, who had long since abandoned any pretense of discipline or strategy in favor of pure, in unhinged slaughter, led the assault with their characteristic frenzy. Behind them came bloodletters, lesser demons of horn made of congealed rage and malice, their hellblades dripping with the promise of skulls for the blood god's throne. Skull champions bellowed challenges that echoed off the walls of mausoleums and ossuaries, their voices carrying the weight of pledges made to a deity who valued nothing but violence. The excoriators fought with the stubborn courage of their lineage, giving ground inch by bloody inch and making the enemy pay dearly for every meter of advance. Every room, every corridor, every chapel and crypt became a killing ground where ceramite-clad warriors grappled with howling berserkers in close combat so brutal that the very stones beneath their feet were cracked by the force of the blows they traded. Yet the excoriators excelled at this kind of war, the grinding, attritional combat that wore down an enemy through sheer bloody-minded refusal to break. But the numbers were simply too great. For every Chaos warrior that fell, 2 more surged forward to take his place. One by one, the defensive positions fell. One by one, the Battle Brothers died, their gene seed harvested where possible, their bodies left where they fell when there was no time to recover them. As the 5th Company faced its inevitable destruction, as the last barricades crumbled and the last magazines ran dry, the surviving excoriators did what Space Marines have always done in their final moments. They prayed, not for salvation, not for rescue, but simply for the strength to die well, to take as many of the enemy with them as possible, and to make their deaths worthy of the chapter's honor. And then the Legion arrived. A vessel appeared in orbit, a ship that system defense monitors identified as bearing a striking resemblance to the ancient star fortress Raptorus Rex, the long-lost flagship of the Firehawks. Before anyone could process this impossible sighting, the ship opened fire on the Chaos fleet in orbit, systematically obliterating the warships that had carried the Holocaust to Certus Minor. And on the ground, in the blood-soaked streets of Obsequa City, the spectral warriors materialized among the Chaos forces with devastating effect. The butchers of the blood god became the butchered. The legionnaires tore through the Holocaust with a precision and ferocity that defied everything the Hornate warriors believed about the supremacy of their patron deity. So here were warriors who fought with a cold fury that made the blood god's raging madness look like a child's tantrum by comparison. Here was a force that could not be intimidated, could not be broken, and could not be stopped by any conventional means. The Holocaust Blood Crusade was annihilated in its entirety. Not defeated, not routed, but destroyed. Every single warrior, every demon, every screaming cultist who had followed the blood-red comet to Certus Minor. The Legion left no survivors among the enemy, which is itself significant, because it suggests a level of thoroughness that goes beyond tactical necessity and into the realm of divine judgment. One particularly notable moment from the battle, preserved in the novel's account, describes an excoriator scout discovering a specific legionnaire among the spectral warriors. The details of this encounter are left deliberately ambiguous, but the implication is clear. Among the ranks of the Legion of the Damned, there are individuals who can be recognized, or almost recognized, as if they were once specific people whose identities have been blurred but not entirely erased by their transformation. When the battle was over, the Legion vanished, as they always do. The excoriators were left alive, stunned, and struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. Certus Minor, the cemetery world, had been saved by warriors who were themselves arguably dead. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Battle of Certus Minor was dramatic, but it was far from the only time the Legion of the Damned changed the course of a conflict. Across the millennia, they have appeared at dozens of pivotal moments, always arriving at the last possible instant, always turning the tide of battles that were already lost. In the novel, The Chapter's Due, by Graham McNeill, the Legion appeared on Calth, the Ultramarines' homeworld that had been the site of one of the Horus Heresy's most devastating betrayals. Captain Uriel Ventris, and a small force of ultramarines found themselves trapped in the lost tomb of the legendary Captain Remus Ventanus, a hero of the Battle of Calth, who had died 10,000 years earlier. The Iron Warriors, led by the warsmith Honsu, had cornered the ultramarines and were preparing to finish them off. Then the Legion materialized, their spectral fire filling the ancient corridors of the tomb. They tore through the Iron Warriors with devastating efficiency. But it was what one legionnaire did that made this encounter truly remarkable. Uriel Ventris observed a specific legionnaire bearing barely legible insignia on his shoulder pad, an inverted omega symbol, the mark of the Ultramarines. The figure carried other traces of Ultramarines' heraldry, weathered and faded, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It was implied, though never explicitly confirmed, that this legionnaire was the spirit of Remus Ventanus himself, the savior of Calth, dead for 10 millennia, but still fighting to defend the world he had given his life to protect. Ventanus had been one of the great heroes of the Horus heresy, a captain of the Ultramarines' 4th Company who had rallied the defenders of Calth during the Wordbearer's treacherous assault, or organized the evacuation of civilians into the underground arcologies when the planet's star was poisoned by chaos sorcery and led the resistance during the long Calth underworld war that followed. He had been a legend in his own lifetime and a hero worshipped by generations of Ultramarines after his death. He had been buried in an elaborate tomb on Calth, one supposedly designed by the Primarch Guilliman himself, alongside the Shard of Erebus, a ritual knife that had played a role in the original battle. And now, 10,000 years later, his ghost walked among the Legion of the Damned, still bearing the faded marks of his chapter, still fighting to protect the world he had bled for in life. Before the Legion vanished, this figure whispered the true name of the Demon Lord who was orchestrating the attack on Ultramar, and left behind the weapon needed to destroy it. A dead hero, reaching across 10,000 years of time and the boundary between life and death itself, to save the chapter he had served in life. The moment is extraordinary, even by the standards of a universe where extraordinary things happen every day. This event is significant because it suggests that the Legion of the Damned is not limited to the remnants of the Firehawks chapter. If Remus Ventanus, an ultramarine who died long before the Firehawks were even created, could appear among the Legion's ranks, then the origin of these spectral warriors is far more complex than a simple case of warp-transformed Marines. The defense of the Phalanx is another critical moment in the Legion's history, one that demonstrates the sheer scale of their interventions when the stakes are highest. In the days leading up to the 13th Black Crusade, the warsmith Shontu of the Iron Warriors launched an audacious attack on the Phalanx itself, the massive star fortress that serves as the Imperial Fist's headquarters. The Phalanx is one of the most ancient and powerful vessels in the entire Imperium, a mobile fortress of such immense size that it dwarfs even the largest battleships. It is said to have been constructed during the Age of Technology, and it served as the home of the Imperial Fists throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. To attack it is to attack one of the great symbols of the Imperium's military might, a vessel whose loss would be felt across the entire galaxy. Shontu and his demonic allies emerged from a warp rift in the very heart of the vessel, bypassing its formidable external defenses entirely. And battle erupted in the corridors and chambers of the ancient ship as the newly forged 3rd Company of the Imperial Fists found themselves fighting desperately to repel borders that included the demon prince Belacor himself, one of the most powerful and ancient demon princes in existence. Shontu's goal was audacious beyond measure. He intended to seize the Phalanx's continent-wrecking weaponry and turn it on the Imperial Palace on Terra's surface, striking at the Emperor himself, using one of humanity's most sacred vessels. The Imperial Fists made the desperate decision to translate the Phalanx into the warp itself, hoping to prevent the weapons from being used against Terra, even at the cost of their own lives. And there, in the screaming madness of the Imperium, the lower decks were suddenly awash with spectral fire. An unprecedented number of the Legion of the Damned stamped through the corridors of the phalanx, pitilessly exterminating the demons that had infested the vessel. The Imperial fists, prepared to fight to the last man, took heart and launched a counterattack that eventually cleared the ship. The Legion remained aboard the phalanx, fighting alongside the Imperial fists as the great vessel moved to aid the defenders of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade. And it was there, at the pivotal moment of the entire campaign, that the Legion made what may be their most significant contribution to the survival of the Imperium. The Blackstone fortress known as the Will of Eternity was in Abaddon, the Despoiler's hands, and he intended to use its unimaginable destructive power to obliterate Cadia. The Space Wolf's wolf. Lord Sven Bloodhowl and his fire howlers launched a boarding action against the fortress, attempting to destroy its power interchanger and render it inoperable. They were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming chaos forces when the Legion of the Damned appeared to support them. Together, the Space Wolves and the Legionnaires destroyed the power systems, allowing the Phalanx to open fire on the Will of Eternity and disable it. Even Abaddon the Despoiler himself took the field against the Legion during this battle, and while his warp-enhanced might was enough to force the spectral warriors back, it was a testament to their power that even the War Master of Chaos could not simply dismiss them. Abaddon survived, and he ultimately destroyed Cadia by crashing the disabled Blackstone fortress into its surface. But the Legion's intervention had bought the Imperium precious time and ensured that Abaddon's original plan, to use the fortress's weapons rather than sacrifice it, was thwarted. When the Great Rift tore across the galaxy, following Cadia's fall, splitting the Imperium in two, and plunging countless worlds into darkness and terror, the Legion of the Damned appeared on world after world, as if the cosmic catastrophe had somehow amplified their ability to manifest or removed whatever constraints had previously limited the frequency of their appearances. During the period known as the Noctis Aeterna, when the light of the Astronomicon was temporarily extinguished and the Imperium was plunged into a darkness so complete that warp travel became all but impossible, the Legion was sighted on Baal, defending the Blood Angels against the horrors of Hive Fleet Leviathan. They appeared on Armageddon, that perennial war zone, fighting alongside the Imperial defenders against whatever fresh threat had come calling. They were seen on Antagonus and on 100 other worlds where the forces of chaos sought to exploit the galaxy's greatest crisis since the Horus Heresy. The sheer scale of the Legion's appearances during the Noctis Aeterna raises important questions. If the Legion is simply the remnant of the Firehawks, a chapter that was already reduced to fewer than 200 Marines before their transformation, how could they possibly appear on hundreds of worlds simultaneously? Even with the warp's distortion of time and space, even with the recruitment mechanism implied by the Animus Malorum, but the logistics seem impossible for a conventional military force. Either the Legion has grown far beyond its original numbers, or the theories about its nature being something other than transformed Marines are closer to the truth. They even appeared during the Terran Crusade, helping the newly resurrected Primarch Roboute Guilliman escape from the Blackstone fortress, where he had been imprisoned by the forces of chaos. The Legion engaged the greater demon Skarbrand, one of Khorne's mightiest champions, a being of such immense destructive power that it had once attempted to strike Khorne himself and been cast out of the Blood God's realm for the insult. To say that fighting Skarbrand is dangerous would be like saying that standing in a supernova is warm. It is a confrontation that few living beings could survive for even a moment. The Legion held the demon long enough for Guilliman and his companions to escape through a secret webway passage, buying the Imperium's last, best hope for survival with their own spectral bodies. Think about what that means. The Legion of the Damned, whatever they are, fought a greater demon of Khorne to protect a resurrected Primarch. This is not a small skirmish on some forgotten frontier world. This is one of the most pivotal events in the entire history of the Imperium, the moment when the first loyal Primarch in 10,000 years was freed to lead the Imperium's defense against the greatest crisis it had ever faced. And the Legion was there, as if they had always been destined to be there. as if the entire arc of their existence had been building to this moment. The Legion has also known defeat, though such occasions are remarkably rare. In one engagement in the 42nd Millennium, they fought alongside an Imperial Fists force under the legendary Darnath Lysander against a demonic incursion. Despite their combined efforts, the Chaos forces proved too strong, and both the Imperial Fists and the Legion were forced to retreat. The world fell to chaos, marking one of the very few recorded instances of the Legion of the Damned failing to achieve victory. This single defeat stands as a sobering reminder that even these spectral warriors are not omnipotent, that there are forces in the galaxy that can match or exceed even their supernatural might. Among the silent ranks of the Legion, there is one figure who has been identified repeatedly across multiple engagements. A warrior who stands out from his brothers, not through any visible mark of rank, but through the terrible relic he carries into battle. His name is Attica Centurius, and he is believed to have once been a veteran sergeant of the Firehawks chapter. Centurius is, in many ways, the closest thing the Legion of the Damned has to a known individual. The other legionnaires are anonymous, their identities erased by the transformation they have undergone, their faces hidden behind helms, also altered by the warp contagion that recognition is impossible. But Centurius has been spotted again and again, always in the thick of the fighting, always carrying the same artifact, the same weapon that has become his defining characteristic. It is called the Animus Malorum, which translates roughly as the soul of the damned, and it is one of the most disturbing objects described in Imperial records. The Animus Malorum takes the form of an ancient skull, worn and blackened by age and exposure to energies that no human bone should ever have been subjected to. The skull bears 3 service studs bolted into its forehead, the kind of studs that Space Marines receive for long service, each one representing a century of warfare. This detail suggests that the skull once belonged to an Astartes of significant rank and experience, possibly a captain or similarly senior officer. Some theorize it may be all that remains of Centurius's former commanding officer, preserved and transformed into a weapon of terrible power. When Centurius raises the Animus Malorum, its empty eye sockets blaze with light, a cold, almost pale fire that has nothing in common with the warm glow of imperial faith or the hellish illumination of chaos sorcery. The light reaches out to the skull's target, and the effect is immediate and horrifying. The victim withers, their body collapsing inward as if their very essence is being drawn out through their pores. The target's soul, for want of a better word, is torn from their body and consumed by the skull, absorbed into whatever reservoir of power sustains the relic. But the Animus Malorum does more than simply destroy. Each time it claims a soul, the spectral energy that surrounds the legionnaires in Centurius's vicinity intensifies. Within this thickened aura, the Legion becomes even more resistant to harm than usual. Damaged armor reforms, wounds close with impossible speed, and most remarkably, as legionnaires who have fallen in battle rise again, their spectral forms reconstituting as if the energy released by the consumed soul is being used to restore them. The implications of this are staggering. The Animus Malorum suggests that the Legion of the Damned operates on a fundamentally different level than any other fighting force in the Imperium. They are not simply tough warriors in blessed armor. They are beings whose existence is sustained by the consumption of soul energy, beings who can literally resurrect their fallen through the death of their enemies. This puts them in the same category as demons, who are sustained by the emotional energy of mortals or vampires, who feed on blood and life force. The comparison is uncomfortable, but it is difficult to avoid. There is also evidence from the short story Animus Malorum by Laurie Goulding that Centurius uses the relic to recruit new members for the Legion. In this account, the Animus Malorum absorbs the souls of fallen Space Marines, claiming them for the Legion and giving them a new existence as spectral warriors. The process requires the physical death of the Astartes body, and the choice is presented to stranded or dying Marines as an alternative to simply ceasing to exist. You can die, or you can continue to serve the Emperor beyond the point of death. For many Space Marines, that is not really a choice at all. This recruitment mechanic raises fascinating questions about the composition of the Legion. If Centurius is actively adding new members from other chapters, then the Legion of the Damned is not a static force slowly dwindling as its original Firehawks members succumb to the warp contagion. It is a growing army of the dead, replenishing its ranks from every chapter in the Imperium, drawing in the souls of fallen warriors who are willing to trade eternal rest for eternal war. This would explain how a chapter that started with fewer than 200 survivors has been able to appear in force at battles across the galaxy for centuries, sometimes in numbers that far exceed what the original Firehawks contingent could have mustered. It raises uncomfortable ethical questions as well. The choice offered to dying Marines, serve in the Legion, or simply cease to exist, is arguably not a real choice at all. When you are bleeding out on a battlefield with your gene seed exposed and your brothers lying dead around you, when a spectral figure offers you the chance to keep fighting rather than surrender to the void, how free are you really? Is the Legion a volunteer force, or is it something closer to a draft, conscripting the souls of the fallen through the simple expedient of offering them the only alternative to oblivion? It would also explain the Calth incident, where a Legionnaire bore the unmistakable markings of an Ultramarine who had died 10,000 years ago. If the Legion can recruit across chapters and across time, if the warp's distortion of temporal reality means that a warrior who fell during the Horus heresy can be drawn into the Legion's ranks just as easily as one who died yesterday, then the Legion is potentially drawing on the entire history of the Imperium's wars for its membership. The thought is humbling and terrifying in equal measure. Somewhere in the warp, an army of the dead grows larger with every battle, sustained by faith, sustained by the Emperor's will, sustained by the consumed souls of the Imperium's enemies. And at its head walks Attica Centurius, bearing the skull that feeds them all, a shepherd of ghosts tending his flock of the damned. So what are they? What is the Legion of the Damned, really? This is the question that has haunted inquisitors, librarians, chaplains, and scholars of the Adeptus Astartes for centuries. And the truth, insofar as there is one, is that the Imperium does not know. The lore of Warhammer 40,000 deliberately preserves the mystery, offering multiple competing theories, each supported by some evidence and contradicted by other evidence, and leaving the final answer suspended in a state of deliberate ambiguity. But we can examine each theory in turn, weighing the evidence and the implications, and see which one feels closest to the truth. Or, perhaps more accurately, we can see which combination of theories might best explain the contradictory evidence that exists. The first and oldest theory is also the most straightforward. The Legion of the Damned is the remnant of the Firehawks chapter, transformed by the warp storm that consumed their fleet, but retaining their loyalty and their fighting capability. Under this theory, the warp contagion that infected them did not simply destroy their bodies. It altered them on a fundamental level, and blending their physical forms with the stuff of the warp itself until they existed in a state between material reality and the immaterium. They are not ghosts. They are not demons. They are Space Marines who have been changed by the warp in much the same way that Chaos Space Marines are changed by the warp, but in a direction that preserved their loyalty rather than destroying it. This theory is supported by the early evidence, particularly the recovery of the Firehawks chapter banner, with its inscription about serving the Emperor beyond the point of death, and the serial numbers on recovered equipment matching Firehawks records. It is also supported by the appearance of the Raptorus Rex at Certus Minor, and suggesting that the Firehawks' ancient fortress monastery survived the warp storm and continues to serve as the Legion's base of operations. However, this theory struggles to explain how a chapter that started with fewer than 200 survivors has been able to sustain itself across centuries of constant warfare. It also cannot easily account for the appearance of legionnaires bearing the markings of other chapters, such as the Ultramarine at Calth. If the Legion is solely composed of Firehawks, these anomalies are difficult to explain. The second theory proposes that the Legion of the Damned is a psychic phenomenon, a manifestation of the collective trauma of the Space Marines. Under this theory, events of extreme psychological impact, such as the massacres at Istvan or the death of a Primarch, has left permanent scars on the collective psyche of the Astartes. These scars have permeated every chapter since the Horus Heresy, carried in the gene seed itself, or in the shared cultural memory that all Space Marines inherit from their predecessors. The deep-seated belief that the betrayers must be punished, that the fallen must be avenged, that loyalty must be rewarded, has accumulated psychic weight over 10,000 years until it has become capable of manifesting physically. Under this theory, the Legion appears when Space Marine librarians, consciously or unconsciously, tap into this reservoir of collective psychic energy and give it form. The fallen brothers, the betrayed loyalists, the unavenged dead all surge up from the psychic depths and take shape on the battlefield, but their form determined by the collective image of what vengeance should look like. This would explain why the Legion always appears where Space Marines are present, because it is the psychic energy of the Astartes themselves that summons them. This theory is elegant, and it carries a certain poetic weight. The idea that 10,000 years of trauma have accumulated into something that can fight back, that the collective grief and rage of every Space Marine who ever watched a brother fall to treachery has coalesced into a force that manifests in moments of desperate need, is deeply compelling. It taps into something primal about human storytelling, the notion that the dead protect the living, that the sacrifices of the past are not wasted, but continue to echo forward through time, growing stronger with each repetition. But the theory has its own limitations. It suggests that the Legion is essentially an illusion, a psychic projection, and that is hard to reconcile with the very real and very physical damage they inflict on their enemies. Dead greenskins and shattered Chaos Marines are not the products of hallucination. They are the products of real weapons wielded by real hands, or at least by something that can perfectly simulate reality. The third theory is darker and more radical. The Legion of the Damned represents the Emperor's own demons. This theory was championed by the renegade Inquisitor Quixos, who was eventually killed by his fellow Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn for his increasingly radical beliefs and dangerous experiments. Quixos proposed that just as the dark gods of chaos have demonic servants made of the same soul stuff that sustains them, the Emperor's vast psychic power and the concentrated faith of trillions of human beings have given rise to a class of supernatural agents that serve the Imperial will. Under this theory, the Legionnaires of the Damned are not the spirits of dead Marines or psychic projections. They are genuine warp entities, fragments of the Emperor's consciousness given form and purpose. They are, in the most literal sense, the demons of the Emperor, angels of death sent forth by the Master of Mankind to defend his servants in their darkest hour. Quixos further speculated that these entities could take many forms, just as the demons of the Chaos Gods range from the insignificant to the apocalyptic, and that the Space Marine form is simply the shape that the Emperor's will takes when it manifests on a battlefield. This theory is profoundly disturbing to orthodox imperial theology, which insists that the Emperor is not a god and that demons are exclusively the servants of chaos. The idea that the Emperor has his own demons, his own supernatural servants born of faith and psychic power, undermines the fundamental distinction between the Imperium and the forces it fights against. It suggests that the Emperor has become, or always was, something very similar to the entities that dwell in the warp, differing from them not in nature, but only in allegiance. If the Chaos Gods can create demons from the emotional energy of mortals, and if the Emperor's power is fed by the faith of trillions, then the creation of Imperial demons is not just possible, but arguably inevitable. Quixos went further still, speculating that these entities, which he called Engels Mortis, or Angels of Death, could take many forms, just as the demons of the Chaos Gods range from the diminutive Nurglings and blue horrors to the towering greater demons that can challenge entire armies. The Space Marine form, he suggested, was simply the shape that the Emperor's will took when it manifested on a battlefield, because that was the form most associated with salvation and deliverance in the collective consciousness of the Imperium. But other forms might exist, greater and more terrible, forms that have not yet been recorded because the circumstances that would summon them have not yet arisen. The implications of that suggestion are staggering and, as for anyone who values the traditional theology of the Imperium, deeply heretical. Quickshoss also noted that almost every confirmed appearance of the Legion occurred in areas where the barrier between the material realm and the warp was thin or compromised. Warp storms, chaos incursions, planets near the Eye of Terror, these were the locations where the Legion most frequently appeared. This is consistent with a demonic nature, as all warp entities find it easier to manifest where the veil between realms is weakened. It is also consistent with the Firehawks theory, since warp-transformed Marines might similarly require thin spots in reality to cross between the immaterium and the material universe. The evidence cuts both ways, which is precisely why the mystery endures, and the evidence supporting it is uncomfortable. Add the Legion's ability to appear and disappear at will, their resistance to physical harm, their capacity for self-resurrection, and the soul-consuming power of the animus malorum are all characteristics that are more consistent with demonic entities than with any known form of space marine. A fourth theory, held by radical elements within the Librarius, proposes that the Legion is a consensual hallucination made real by the collective psychic power of mankind as a whole. This theory builds on the psychic backlash theory, but expands it beyond the Space Marines to encompass all of humanity. The idea is that the trillions upon trillions of humans who populate the Imperium each possess a tiny spark of psychic ability, so small as to be undetectable in any individual, but immensely powerful when combined across the entire species. When human beings are desperate, when they are facing death and praying for salvation, their collective psychic energy creates a reservoir that can be tapped, even by those who don't realize they're doing it. The Space Marines have become the universal symbol of hope and deliverance in the Imperium. When people pray for salvation, they imagine angels in armor, giants with bolters and chainswords who will descend from the sky and destroy their enemies. The Legion of the Damned, under this theory, is the physical manifestation of that prayer, the collected faith of untold trillions of human beings, given form and purpose by the collective unconscious of the species. This theory would explain why the Legion takes the form of Space Marines specifically, and why they only appear at moments of absolute desperation. One, because it is only at such moments that the psychic energy of the surrounding population reaches a concentration sufficient to manifest physically. It is, in essence, the theory that miracles are real, but that they are powered not by divine intervention, but by the unrecognized psychic abilities of humanity itself. There is also the Eldar perspective to consider. The Eldari, with their vastly more sophisticated understanding of the warp, reportedly regard the Legion of the Damned with something that might be recognition. An Eldar autarch is quoted as simply calling them demons, without further elaboration, as if the nature of these beings is perfectly obvious to a race that has been dealing with warp entities for millions of years. The Eldari see no distinction between the demons of chaos and the spectral warriors of the Emperor, as they are all warp creatures, all fed by psychic energy, all shaped by the beliefs and emotions of the mortal races. The only difference is which emotions sustain them and which mortal mind directs their purpose. Finally, there is a synthesis theory suggested by what has been called Quadrimesta's thesis of perpetual martyrdom. This theory proposes that the Legion members have somehow blended with the substance of the warp, contracting a metaphysical contagion that allows them to die and be reborn, much as a banished demon can eventually reform and return to the service of its patron power. Under this reading, the Legionnaires are trapped in an endless cycle of death and resurrection, eternally seeking redemption through service, but unable to achieve it because the very contamination that grants them their power also prevents them from finding the peace of true death. Each battle, each intervention, each act of saving the Imperium's servants is another attempt to purge the taint from their souls, another act of penance offered in the hope that it will be enough to earn them rest. But it never is, because the contagion is fundamental to what they are now. Remove it, and they cease to exist. Keep it, and they remain trapped in this cycle of warfare and resurrection, never quite alive, never quite dead, never quite clean. This is perhaps the most tragic interpretation of the Legion's existence. They are not supernatural avengers or divine agents. They are prisoners, condemned to fight and die and fight again forever. They are seeking a purity that their warp-tainted nature will never permit them to achieve. Their interventions are not acts of mercy or divine will. They are acts of desperation, attempts to earn through service the forgiveness that their contaminated state makes impossible. In the end, the lore of Warhammer 40,000 does not definitively answer the question of what the Legion of the Damned truly is. And that is precisely the point. The Legion exists in the space between explanations, in the gap between faith and reason, between the material and the immaterial. They are designed to be mysterious, to resist categorization, to embody the fundamental uncertainty that lies at the heart of a universe where gods and demons are real, but their nature is understood by no one, least of all by the mortals who worship and fear them. Beyond the specific details of their history and their battlefield appearances, the Legion of the Damned serves a deeper narrative function within the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They represent something that the grimdark universe desperately needs, but can rarely afford to acknowledge: the possibility of grace. In a universe defined by the tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." The Legion of the Damned is a crack in that absolute statement. They suggest that war is not quite the only thing, that somewhere, in the spaces between the screaming and the dying, there is something else, a force that responds to faith, that rewards loyalty, that refuses to let the worthy die unremarked and unavenged. This is what makes the Legion so compelling as a narrative element. They are not heroes in the traditional sense. They do not inspire through charisma or lead through example. They are, by any objective standard, horrifying. They are the walking dead, consumed by a disease that should have killed them centuries ago, sustained by means that no rational mind can explain, and driven by purposes that may not be their own. They are, depending on your perspective, either the most blessed or the most cursed beings in the Imperium. And yet, when they appear, they save lives. When they manifest on a battlefield where all hope has been extinguished, they bring something that the Imperium almost never experiences: a genuine miracle. Not the manufactured miracles of the ecclesiarchy, not the propaganda miracles of the imperial propaganda machine, but a real, tangible, undeniable intervention by a force that seems to care whether the Imperium survives. Whether that force is the Emperor himself, or the collective psyche of humanity, or the transformed remnants of the Firehawks, or something else entirely, the effect is the same. In the darkest moments, when the enemies of humanity press in from every direction and the defenders have exhausted every resource and every option, something appears in the flames and the smoke. Something fights for them. Something refuses to let them die alone. This is the true power of the Legion of the Damned as a concept. They take the nihilism of the 40,000 setting and inject into it a thread of something that might, if you squint hard enough through the flames and the skulls and the midnight black armor, look almost like hope. The Legion also raises profound questions about the nature of service and sacrifice in the Imperium. Space Marines are already warriors who have given up everything, their original identities, their families, their futures, to serve the Emperor. They are taken as children, subjected to years of agonizing surgical procedures that transform them into something more and less than human. and then sent into an endless war that will consume the rest of their lives. They accept this willingly, or at least they accept it because the alternative is worse, because the enemies pressing in from every direction demand that someone stand between them and the people they would destroy. But the Legion has given up more than that. They have given up death itself, the one release that every living being is promised, the final rest that makes the suffering of life bearable. They have been denied the peace that comes with ending, and they continue to fight, not because they choose to, but because the alternative, the slow erosion of everything they were, the gradual transformation into something that is no longer recognizably human, is a prospect too terrible to contemplate in stillness. Consider what it means to be a legionnaire. You were once a man, in the distant way that space marines are men. You had a name, a chapter, a brotherhood of warriors who knew your face and your voice, and the specific way you loaded your bolter before an engagement. You had memories of training, of combat, of the quiet moments between battles when you maintained your equipment and spoke with your brothers about the campaigns ahead. You may even have had memories from before your transformation, dim and distant recollections of a childhood on some imperial world, as of a family you can no longer picture, of a sky you can no longer name, and now all of that is fading. The warp contagion, or whatever force sustains you, is burning away everything that made you who you were, leaving behind only the warrior's purpose, the instinct to fight, the compulsion to serve. Your face has become a skull's face, your eyes have become pits of cold fire, and your voice, if you still have one, carries nothing of the person you used to be. You are becoming a weapon, pure and simple, and the terrible irony is that you can feel yourself becoming it, can feel the memories slipping away, can feel the humanity draining out of you, like water from a cracked vessel. And yet, you continue to fight. You continue to serve. You appear on battlefields where the Imperium's servants are about to die, and you save them, not because you can feel compassion for them anymore, but because somewhere in the deepest core of what remains of your consciousness, there is a conviction that will not die. This is what you were made to do. This is what you exist for. This is the purpose that survives when everything else has been consumed. In this way, the Legion of the Damned is a mirror held up to the entire Space Marine concept. It asks, what happens when the ultimate warriors encounter the ultimate sacrifice? What happens when duty extends beyond death, beyond reason, beyond the capacity of the human soul to endure? The answer, the lore suggests, is something beautiful and terrible at the same time, a force that embodies both the highest ideals and the deepest horrors of the Imperium it serves. The Legion of the Damned debuted in White Dwarf issue 99 back in 1988, while in an article by Rick Priestley, one of the original creators of Warhammer 40,000. In those early days, the connection to the Firehawks was stated as fact rather than theory. Priestley laid out the entire backstory with the explicit directness that characterized early Warhammer 40,000 lore, where mysteries were presented as solved puzzles rather than the tantalizing enigmas they would later become. But as the setting matured and Games Workshop recognized the power of ambiguity, the lore evolved to preserve the mystery that makes the Legion so fascinating. It is worth noting that the Legion of the Damned as a concept may have been inspired by real-world military folklore, specifically the legend of the Angel of Mons from the First World War. In 1914, both the Welsh author Arthur Machen published a short story called The Bowman, in which a British soldier, praying to St. George during the desperate retreat from the Battle of Mons, summons a host of ghostly archers from the Battle of Agincourt to destroy the advancing German forces. The story was fiction, but it was so widely repeated and embellished that it became the basis for the popular myth of the Angel of Mons, a supernatural being that supposedly protected British soldiers during the battle. The parallels to the Legion of the Damned are obvious, spectral warriors appearing in a moment of desperation, summoned by faith and prayer, fighting with impossible effectiveness before vanishing without a trace. The Legion is, in many ways, the 41st Millennium version of this eternal story. The tale every soldier tells about the ghosts who came to save them when all hope was lost. The 6th edition Codex, Legion of the Damned, released as a digital supplement, presented the Firehawks connection as one theory among many, and subsequent publications have maintained this approach, ensuring that the Legion remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 41st millennium. And honestly, that is how it should be. Some mysteries are more powerful as mysteries than they could ever be as answered questions. The Legion of the Damned is one of those mysteries. They are the galaxy's ghost story, the campfire tale that space marines tell each other in the quiet hours between battles, the legend that guardsmen whisper about when the night is dark and the enemy is closing in. They are the promise that even in a universe of unrelenting horror, something watches over those who serve with courage and faith. Whether that something is a god, a ghost, or simply the echo of warriors too stubborn to stop fighting, the effect is the same. The Legion of the Damned endures. In dedicato imperatum ultra articula mortis, for the emperor beyond the point of death. They have been serving that motto for centuries, and they show no signs of stopping. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that quiet refusal to surrender, that unbreakable loyalty that persists even after the warrior who bore it has died, may be the closest thing to hope the galaxy has left. And if you listen carefully, late at night, when the stars seem very far away and the darkness presses in from all sides, you might hear them. Not words, exactly, not voices, just a sound, low and distant and steady, like the march of boots on stone, like the hum of power armor cycling through its endless maintenance routines. The sound of warriors who will never stop fighting, who will never lay down their arms, who will never abandon the galaxy they swore to protect. The Legion of the Damned is out there, somewhere between the warp and the real, between life and death, between legend and fact. And when the hour is darkest, when the last wall is falling and the last defender is making peace with their mortality, they will come. They always come, wreathed in fire, clad in black, bearing the marks of death on armor that burns with a light that has no source. They will come, and they will fight, and when the fighting is done, they will vanish, leaving behind nothing but the dead and the living, and a mystery that will never be solved. That is who the Legion of the Damned really is. Not an answer, a question. The most important question the Imperium has ever asked. Is there something watching over us in the darkness? And the Legion's answer, delivered not in words but in fire and fury, and the silence that follows their passing, is always the same. Yes, but you would not want to see what it looks like. And that, my friends, is where we will leave things for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this deep exploration of one of Warhammer 40,000's most haunting and enduring mysteries. If you did, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every like, every subscription, every comment helps the channel grow and tells me that you want more content like this. More deep dives into the lore, more explorations of the stories and mysteries that make this universe so compelling. Drop a comment below and let me know your own theory about the Legion of the Damned. Are they the Firehawks, transformed by the warp but unbroken in their loyalty? Are they the Emperor's own demons, fragments of his will given form? Are they the ghosts of every space marine who ever fell in battle, summoned by the psychic energy of a desperate galaxy? Or are they something else entirely, something that the lore hasn't even hinted at yet? I want to hear from you. Share your theories. Share your favorite Legion of the Damned moments. Share this video with anyone you know who loves Warhammer 40,000 lore. And as always, thank you for spending your time here with me. In a galaxy of only war, it means more than you know. But until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, in the darkest hour, when all hope seems lost, Look for the fire. They are coming. They are always coming. For the Emperor, beyond the point of death.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.